I know how much you guys like stories that take place in the woods, so tonight, I was lucky enough to share a very long one with all of you. Then, I'll be sharing a story involving another dimension. Two very different stories, both great in their own way. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share their stories. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I don't know if I'll survive the night out here, so I'm trying to post this story on July 16th, 2017, in the hopes it gets back to my family. The news needs to know about this, and when I die, I won't be able to tell anyone else. I just pray someone finds my phone so I can get some fucking reception, and warn people about the Bad River Indian Reservation. I want anyone who finds this phone, or happens to read it, should my connection be good enough to get this post through, to have the whole picture, so I may as well start from the beginning. A nice, long weekend of solitude is what I needed to unwind and get rid of this writer's block, and I couldn't think of a better place for that than the northern woods of Wisconsin. I would often make the 5-hour drive up there on 4-day weekends, and stay with a friend in Ashland or Rhinelander to pass the time. It was the middle of July, so there wasn't too many holidays coming up that would drive up hotel prices in the area. So I hopped on Airbnb and started searching. It was only about 15 minutes into looking for a place when I came across a nice, cozy looking cabin. The $50 a night price tag wasn't too shabby, especially since it rented the entire cottage. I quickly read through the description. 4 small bedrooms, double bed in each, living room, bathroom, pond out back that feeds to the Chequamegon Bay. Plenty of hiking trails directly behind the cabin. I was sold. Sure, there were some quirks. Located on Bad River Indian Reservation. Any problems with the locals? Just tell them you're staying at the Garden House. Should problems persist, call the Ashland Sheriff. I read to myself, my brow furrowed. Was that a normal thing? I half reconsidered when I read, park in the parking lot and leave your things in the car. It's a mile walk to the cabin. Keys located in shed. Feel free to use the ATV to get your stuff from your car, so you don't have to carry it the whole way. I wasn't against long hikes. It just seemed strange that there wasn't a drive leading all the way to the cabin. Despite the red flags, I booked the cabin from Friday through Monday for the upcoming weekend, and began to pack. I leisurely read a few reviews about the place as I folded clothing. The tip of, bring a gun for safety, popped up a few times. Apparently there were wolves and bears in the woods. I assumed that, given the location in the woods, and its proximity to the nearest town, bringing some form of protection was recommended. I packed my 12 gauge, just to be safe. I arrived Friday afternoon and found the parking lot the website had spoken of. It was fairly out of the way, and hard to find, if you weren't looking for it. I jumped out the car and popped open the trunk to grab my shotgun. There was still a few hours of sunlight left, but the animals here may be less wary during the day, and I wasn't going to take any chances. As I was loading a few shells into my gun, I heard the sound of an engine behind me, and rocks picking up under the tires, as the vehicle turned into the lot. "Hey, this is Indian land. What the hell are you doing here?" he asked, his sharp, brown eyes trained on me. "If you're poaching, I'll kill you quicker than you can train that gun on me," he stated, the barrel of his pistol poking out from over the window. No, I started hesitantly. I had never had a gun pointed at me before, and believe me, it is not a pleasant experience. I'm staying at the Garden House." "Oh," he replied, dropping the pistol on his passenger seat. He looked up at the trailhead that led into the woods, then checked his watch. "You want to get a move on? Sun's going down soon." "Thanks," I half whispered. "I'll keep that in mind." The man smiled a nearly toothless grin, nodded back before turning around and driving off. I watched him go for a minute before I decided it would be best to get going sooner rather than later. I locked my car, shoved my keys in my pocket, and slung my shotgun across my back before I headed to the start of the trail. The walk back was actually quite pleasant. By then, the sun was well below the horizon. I walked out back and took a deep breath, the clean air swirling around inside my lungs. I gave a loud, satisfied exhale as I looked around the grounds. There was a nice-sized pond that was connected to a river that meandered across the property, as well as a few trailheads that snaked their way off into the woods. I decided to head down to the pond and sit for a while on one of the few chairs that were laid out. I sat in silence and awe as I looked around at the scenery. I only lingered by the pond for a few minutes before calling it a night. The next morning, I woke with the sun. I threw on a long-sleeved t-shirt and a pair of shorts before slipping on my pair of running shoes and sliding my shotgun onto my back. I shivered a bit at the chilly morning air. I stared at the 3 trailheads for a minute, deciding which one I should take before settling on the path on the right. 10 minutes into my run, or at least I thought it was 10 minutes, I had sort of lost track of time. I had been mesmerized by the beauty of the bright green leaves in the morning sunlight. I heard a voice somewhere off the trail. "Hey, who's there?" they called. I stopped and looked off in the direction the voice had come from. The forest floor was dense and overrun with brambles and roots and fallen branches that had accumulated over the centuries these trees had been here. I couldn't see anyone, but with the overgrown vegetation, I could have just been missing a non-moving figure off in the distance. "Hello?" I called back, waving an arm. "Jesus, who's there?" they called again, and I shook my head, completely confused. "Hey, my name's David," I called. "I'm staying at the garden place." Wolves howled somewhere in the distance, beyond the voice. It caught me off guard. Aren't wolves nocturnal? I thought to myself. Standing on my tiptoes to see the man calling to me, the wolves howled again, closer this time. "Hello? Who is that out there?" A woman's voice called. She sounded like she was probably with the man, a couple out on a walk, but their voices sounded worried. I was worried. I just heard wolves howling not 50 yards away. "I'm gonna shoot you," the man yelled out as the wolves sounded again, almost right on top of us. I heard barking and the woman screamed. The man made a startled noise, and only one more sentence floated across the air amid the barking and snarling that had begun. I heard rustling and twigs snapping off to my left, followed by the screams of the woman again. I quickly unslung my shotgun and fired a shot into the brush before cycling the shell, taking aim again. The gray shape of the wolf took off, away from me, back into the woods. "Help!" the man cried, and I ran towards him, gun at the ready. "Help!" he cried again, closer now. "Where are you?" I yelled, constantly scanning my surroundings, listening for any signs of movement. As I slowly approached where I thought the couple was, my foot kicked something. I chanced to glance down and saw a camcorder. It was an older model that looked like it had been lying outside for years. I hesitated, getting an uneasy feeling in my stomach. "Hello?" I yelled, desperate to try to find the hurt couple. "Where are you? I'm coming to help." I stood, rooted to the spot, my ears straining for any sign of noise, but the forest was silent. I cautiously reached down and picked up the camcorder, and, after putting my hand through the handle, and placing my hand back on the pump of the shotgun, called out again. "Can you hear me?" I screamed, as loudly as I could. I waited for only a minute more, before I backed slowly towards the trail. There was something definitely off about this. The man's voice had been completely alert only moments before. There was no way he could have passed out that quickly, nor had I seen any hide or hair of the pair. I jogged back to the cabin with my shotgun in my hands, ready to fire at anything that may have come out of the bushes. When I arrived, I immediately went to grab my phone and called 911. The rings were short, interrupted by the terrible service I had at the area. Come on, pick up," I whispered to the phone, willing the call to go through. "Come on." 911, what's your emergency? I heard the broken syllables, music to my ears. "I'm at the garden cabin on the Bad River Reserve," I said slowly, trying to remain calm and as understandable as possible. "I was hiking in the woods, and I heard a couple get attacked by wolves. I couldn't find them. They need help," I concluded. Silence. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I was still connected to the dispatcher. I waited. "Can you repeat that, sir?" Yes, I'm at the garden cabin on the Bad River. The phone beeped 3 times in my ear. I wrenched it away and stared at the screen. The words, "Call disconnected," blinking a few times before it went back to my home screen. Those people out in the woods were hurt and needed help. But if I left to find them, if the police arrived, they'd have no idea where I'd be. I sat myself down on the couch, trying to stay calm. I tried to be as clear-minded as possible. I wasn't first aid trained. I had no idea how to help anyone that could have been injured by a wolf. I'd be no help to those people by leaving to look for them. I resigned myself to sit and wait for the police. As I sat, my eyes came to rest upon the camcorder. I walked over and examined it. I attempted to turn it on, but as I feared, the batteries had no power. I had no way to charge them, even if I wanted to. I stared at it for another moment, turning it over in my hands, before I saw the tiny door on the side of it. I slid it out of place and internally cheered. There was an SD card in the memory slot. I popped it out and went to my laptop, sliding the small piece of technology into the slot. I prayed it worked, knowing how corroded the memory chip might be if it had been sitting out there for years. My laptop recognized it immediately. There was one file on it titled 141-02010.mov, which I instinctively opened without thinking. I stared at my screen as the file loaded. It only took a moment, though it seemed like hours. The face of a man who looked to be in his mid to late 30s pops up on screen. He was a fair complexion, contrasted by his dark hair and light gray eyes. He's sitting in the driver's seat of a car, fidgeting with the camouflage sweatshirt he wears. It seems like the camera has been set on the middle of the dashboard before filming started. On the other side of the screen is a dog, a black lab, who is looking lovingly at the man. He smiles widely and begins to speak. "Video log from my lovely wife, October the 14th, 2010, he says, his words matching the timestamp on the bottom right of the frame. The timestamp of 9:12 a.m. blinks in rapid succession. Okay, here's the poop scoop. We have a 7-hour drive. We're meeting Ebo, Q, and Bart at a cabin that was built in the 1920s on Lake Superior, which is now on the Bad River Indian Reservation. We are going to fish for what I hear are giant northern pike, and shoot millards where some river dumps into Checkamaugon Bay." The man holds up a hand and starts putting his finger up as he counts. "The directions are bad. The weather looks bad. The river's bad, and the reservation bad." He looks over to the dog, as if the dog was a co-host on a morning talk show. "That's bad times 4, Borderoo. I hope good company and a good dog trumps 4 bands. Eh, boo?" He looks back at the camera. "Checklist," he says, then crosses himself like a minister. "Spectacles, testicles, wallet, and watch." He chuckles to himself, before reaching to turn off the camera. The screen goes black, 3 seconds of nothing, then the video kicks back on. The timestamp now blinks 5:49 p.m. He stares out the windshield, past the camera as he absentmindedly pets Boo, who attempts to lick his hand. He sits for another minute or so in contemplation before hopping out of the car, grabbing the camera as he does so. He opens the trunk and sets the camera down, the lens facing behind him. Behind the man, an old, red, beat-up pickup truck rolls into view. The driver cranks the window down and leans out. His skin is the color of wet clay, and his hair the dark of midnight. "What are you doing on the reservation?" he calls. I immediately recognize the man. It was the same man in the same truck that had greeted me earlier today. Apparently he was the neighborhood watchdog, and had been for many years, at least back to 2010. The man turns around startled. "I'm Colton Gill. I'm meeting some people at the Garten cabin for the weekend." "You know, I knew old man Garten." He paused for a second as he comes back to reality. "He was an asshole." He shrugged nonchalantly, but my old man liked him because he'd bring a case of hams every time he came up. "You got any beer?" "Yeah, cold cans of Point Special," Colton replied, a small smile creeping into his voice. "You want one?" "Fucking A." Colton turns around and begins rummaging through his bags before noticing the camera is on and turns it off. The video pops back on. The old man is leveling a .22 rifle at something off screen. He shoots, and the camera swings wildly, doing its best to focus on something in the headlights of the truck. A buck staggers out of the forest and collapses, a small circle of red behind its front leg growing larger. Borderoo charges the deer, barking madly as he does so. Colton's voice erupts from behind the mic, booming around the area, crying, "Boo, come on!" The dog halts and turns to look at the two men, before padding back towards them. There's a sound of a distant screen door slamming shut, and the camera pans in that direction, though there's no house. Probably behind all the trees, I thought. "You better get your dog in the car right quick," the old man says. "These dogs coming will kill him." Colton makes some clicking noises, and Borderoo runs around to the passenger door of the car before hopping in. Colton slams the door shut, then runs around to the other side, sliding in neatly behind the wheel, shutting the door after himself. He focuses the camera on the woods as a small pack of large, angry dogs come tearing from the tree line, teeth bared and growling. They surround the car, snarling angrily. After a moment, they turn, almost as one, and descend on the deer carcass. He turns the camera towards the dog and sees the old Indian waving his arms to get his attention. He rolls down the passenger window a bit, enough to hear the old man over the sound of the dogs barking and tearing into the deer. "Hey, if there's anything left of that deer when them dogs get done, take it home so you can get some venison. You better wait till those dogs come back and check you out one more time with their bellies dragging on the ground. If they ain't, and if you and that city dog get out to have a look, there'll be nothing but elbows and assholes in the morning." The camera is almost tossed back onto the dash. Colton pulls his flip phone out of his pocket and stares at it for a second before cursing. Damn it, no reception. Colton looks up and scans the area outside the car. "I don't know if this is true or not, but they've seen mountain lion up here, and I read an article that some wolves killed and partially ate some hiker up in Alaska." He trailed off momentarily. "Some black bear tore apart a tent and dragged some guy in a sleeping bag off into the woods and killed and ate him." Colton visibly shudders and looks to his companion. "Lions and wolves and bears. Oh my." He chuckles at his terrible joke before he fell back into his solemn ways, and his mind drifts back to their current predicament. "Best get comfortable, old buck," he says, leaning his seat back. "This is our bedroom for a while." Once the seat was comfortable enough for Colton, he leans forward to turn off the camera. A quiet, "I'm keeping this gun loaded though," is heard just before the screen went black again. When the screen comes back to life, like another scene, only the clock is seen 4:07. A noise emanates from the screen, the throaty growl of a dog, which had been bristling before the camera cut in. It's Colton's dog, I realized. "What is it, Bill? What do you got?" comes his voice, wary and alert. The camera has adjusted by now, and the light from the crescent moon illuminates the trees as Colton fumbles around the dark cab of the car. The sound of jingling keys followed by the unmistakable dinging of a car turning on. He didn't start the engine, just turned the key enough to get electricity flowing. The cab light springs to life, illuminating the scene. Colton picks up the camera and turns it to the passenger seat. Borderoo has his nose pressed against the window, growling. He bares his teeth and begins snapping at the window. "Boo?" Colton's voice quivered. The tone made it obvious that this was not normal behavior for his dog, but just as quickly as the light had turned on, Borderoo was sitting back in his seat, his tail wagging as he glances over his shoulder back towards the camera. Colton lets out a long, audible, heavy sigh. "What the hell, Boo?" He chuckles a bit. The laughter is cut short. Boo, without warning, stands. The hair on the nape of his neck and all along his back begins to bristle. He resumes snapping and barking at the window, though this time he attempts to back away, his rear feet finding their way over the center console and into Colton's lap. "Borderoo, you're scaring me." Colton manages, still shaken despite the recent laughter. "What are you seeing? Are you smelling something?" The headlights snap on, illuminating a trailhead. "There's nothing there, pal." Colton practically shouts over the din his pet is making. He slowly reaches his other hand out and pats Boo on the haunches. Boo jumps and wheels on the hand, growling again. Until he realizes what he's done, his face immediately adopts a look that oozes, "I'm sorry." He practically jumps into Colton's lap and turns to face the passenger window, calmed down now from his earlier state. Colton places the camera back on the dash, his frame partially covered by Boo's head, only taking up the right half of the screen. He reaches back and pulls out a thermos before he unscrews it and pours some miraculously still steaming black liquid into the cap. He takes a large swig of it before he sets the thermos down and expertly opens a pack of cigarettes with his free hand, jiggles the pack so one white cylinder sits higher than the others, and pulls it from its casing with his lips. The small gold and white box is tossed off frame, and his hand reappears holding a black Bic lighter. He thumbs the wheel a few times before the flame explodes out the top. He leans forward slightly, touching cigarette to flame, and inhales. He exhales through his nose, giving himself an almost dragon-like appearance for a moment as he, like the dog, stares out the passenger window. His left hand meanders over towards the door, thermos cap still clutched between thumb and forefinger. He extends his pinky to operate the passenger window, and rolls it down by only an inch or two. Think them mongrels are still out there? He asks Boo rhetorically. He issues forth one loud whistle, and waits, though it's met with only silence. They're gone. Colton sighs happily. Up, Boo, he commands, opening his door. The dog hops out, followed by Colton. It's quiet for a moment. The trunk door slides upwards with a quiet hiss from the pistons. Colton throws on a backpack, slings a holster around his waist, and places a pistol gently inside. He grabs his shotgun and cycles it. A spent shell from the evening before being ejected to the ground. He grabs a few more odds and ends, checks to see if there's anything else he needs, and slams the door shut. The driver door opens again as Colton grabs the camera and sets it off towards the trailhead. The sky just beginning to get light. Where's that deer? He muses to himself, kicking at the ground with his feet as he walks. His foot finally connects with something, and he focuses the camera's gaze upon it. The old guy was right, he says, sighing. Look at this. All that remains of the deer carcass is a pool of dried, frozen blood, a few flecks of matted fur, and a partial lower jaw that has several teeth still jammed into it. A sudden, jostling noise erupts from off-screen as Colton flinches before turning the camera. A ruffed grouse explodes from the undergrowth and flies deeper into the woods. Colton turns the camera to a focused Bowderoo. You ready to harvest some grouse, buddy? The dog practically smiles into the camera as the screen drops off into a black abyss once again. I press my spacebar to pause the playback and stared at my reflection in the black laptop screen. It's evening this time the camera cuts on, a little 4:32 p.m. blinking in the corner. It's aimed at a picnic table, the same picnic table that's sitting out behind the cabin I was currently occupying, which confirmed my suspicions. There are 3 grouse and woodcocks played out on the table's surface. What a great job you did, Colton said as he turns the camera to Boo. Despite my training, you are turning out to be a hell of a hunting dog after all, old buck. He pans the camera up to the old shed. Well, let's fire up that ATV and get back to the car so we can hump the rest of our stuff in, shall we, buddy? Black screen. The 4:36 p.m. in the corner indicates only a few minutes have passed. The engine of the ATV can be heard idling in the background. Bowderoo stands, aggressively, in front of Colton as he walked down the trail, the camera pointing at the ground. The remains of the deer come into frame, but next to it is one of the mongrel dogs from the night before. Its throat slashed open, and a chunk missing from its side. This was not here this morning, Colton says warily. Wolves in the wire, Bowderoo, he concludes. We're not going anywhere up here without Mr. Smith and Mr. Wesson. He sighs before finishing up his thoughts. We best get everything from the truck in one go. And the screen cuts to black again. 5:20 p.m. The camera looks like it's set up on a kitchen counter, the floor near the entrance visible. Bowderoo is scarfing down a can of dog food as Colton walks from behind the camera to a grouse that's laid out on the floor. He looks like he's about to start cleaning the bird when his phone rings. Colton picks up the cell phone, a look of bewilderment on his face, and walks towards the camera, kneeling. Voicemail. What the? He quickly uses the buttons to call as he mutters a quiet, "How the hell did I get reception?" under his breath. He leans into the camera so the microphone can pick up the call. The message begins with a high, ear-piercing tone that makes Colton flinch and nearly drop the phone before holding it to a healthy distance from his ear. The voice on the recording is choppy and hard to understand.
Hey Colty, it's you. We're
Ashland. Ebo spent night in jail, idiot. Cracked over with the RV. DUI. Clearing up mess now. Getting up ASAP. The voice cuts off immediately. Colton hastily tries to redial the number that left the message, but almost as soon as he puts the phone to his ear, he closes it in frustration. Shit, no coverage. How am I getting voicemails? He reaches up, and the screen goes black. 7:43 p.m. The sun is going down as Colton sets the camera down on the picnic table facing the inset from the river. It really did resemble a large pond, or a small lake more than an inlet. He walks out onto the pier, and sets a shotgun against one of the posts before picking up a fishing rod. He pulls a small fish from a bucket next to him, and hooks the fish before throwing it into the air, and watches as the bobber hits with a satisfying plop in about the same spot. Colton turns to Boo, who was lying next to Colton's chair on the pier. Hey Boo. Colton begins as he reaches over and lovingly taps his shotgun. If we get any mallards flying in, Mr. Smith & Wesson are at our beck and call. He sits in his chair and leans back, taking in the setting sun. This is the kind of multitasking I love. Hoofda. Colton reaches down under his chair and produces a can of beer, which he cracks open, the sound echoing in the small clearing surrounding the pond. Just as he's about to take a sip, he sits bolt upright. Bobber down. He lunges for the rod and begins fighting the fish, straining to keep it close while not letting the line snap. As he hauls it in, he triumphantly holds it towards the camera and says, slightly louder than needed, "Looks like a 37-incher. As he begins the work of extracting the hook from the large fish's mouth, he looks upwards and lets out one loud laugh and hastily tosses the fish, hook, line, bobber, and all, into a separate bucket. He grabs the shotgun and brings it to bear upwards. There's a moment of silence before a deafening bang resounds around the clearing. A second report comes shortly after, and the bodies of 2 ducks fall into frame, tumbling down into the lake. "Fetch 'em up," Colton calls, waving his arms from Bowderoo towards the pond. The dog springs to life, galloping down the wooden pier. He leaps into the water and brings the first bird back to shore. As soon as he's dropped it at Colton's feet, he peels off back down the pier for the second retrieval. As he's waiting for Boo to come back, Colton quickly unhooks the 37-inch northern pike and resets the hook before casting it back into the water once Boo is on dry land. He walks back towards the camera, praising his dog as he does so. A few moments of only a bobber fill the screen as Colton continues cooing to his dog with "good boys," and there he goes. When the two walk back into frame, Boo's still dripping wet. Colton looks down at him. "It's beer 30. You want one?" He chuckles to himself and ruffles the dog's head as he sits back down into his chair and grabs his beer. He takes a few sips as he continues staring at the lake, but not long after, the bobber is ripped under the water without any warning signs. Colton wrenches the pole out of its holder and begins to fight the fish, standing up after a few moments. After a short, intense battle, the line snaps as Colton was pulling the rod tip up, which nearly sends him into the water. "Shit," he exclaims, pounding on the deck. He pushes himself up and stares at the now black water. "That was a 50-incher, Boo." He sighs heavily. "Maybe a 60-incher. "You aren't supposed to be here," a high, shrill voice calls from off camera. Colton whips around as Boo turns, growling lowly. I recognize the voice. It was the same woman who had accosted me when I had first arrived. "Jesus Christ, lady," Colton called from his end of the pier. "You scared the shit out of me. Boo, quit it. Heel." "You aren't supposed to be on this land," she repeats, not walking closer as she warily eyes the dog. "This is an Indian reservation." "Yeah, I know," Colton begins. "But this place was supposed to be grandfathered in because it was built before the reservation was. The Indians were here first," she snaps, her tone low and serious. "Look," Colton says, exasperated. "The owner and 2 of my buddies will be here in a little bit. He can explain it to you. I only got here a little while ago." "You're a liar," she shrieks. "You arrived last night, and were killing our grouse. You killed our ducks, and our fish." Colton jumps in shock in the sudden shift of her voice. He hastily turns around towards the end of the pier. "If you want the northern, or a few grouse, I'd be happy to give you some." he finishes, pulling a large fish out of the bucket, but stands there dumbfounded, staring at the camera. He looks down at Boo, who is looking up at him. Where the hell did she go? Colton sighs and drops the fish back into the bucket, then sits dejectedly in his chair. A wolf howl is heard from what seems to be nearby, and Boo immediately starts barking angrily. Colton reaches out to pet the dog's head and calm him down, but Boo takes off down the pier, to the shore, and off into the woods. Stay. Colton yells when Boo first takes off. Boo, heel! He cries. The man grabs his shotgun and runs full speed off the pier, out of frame, just like his companion. His cries of boo are mixed with the sounds of the dogs barking and wolves snarling. 3 distinct shots ring out loudly and echo. Boo's voice turns from aggressive barking to painful, shrill cries and whimpering that quickly get quieter before fading out. Colton's cries of boo also cease. I stared at the screen in disbelief for a few seconds. When a man's panting was heard from the screen, a phone's voicemail tone goes off just as the camera is picked up. The only thing heard before the screen goes black is Colton's voice. Boo, you stupid son of a bitch. 9:33 p.m. blinks. Darkness. A holster being unbuttoned is heard, a bottle being unscrewed, a glass being slammed onto the table, a shot being poured, a lighter flicking a few times, and Colton inhales deeply. He pours a second shot and takes it. I gotta get a hold of myself, he whispers to the darkness. I'm so scared. It's mucking up reality. He exhales again, and a bit of cigarette smoke wafts into the camera's light. Focus on your hands, just like Dad taught you. Focus on your hands. He gives one single quiet sob. God, I wish Muzi was here. His breaths become less erratic and more uniform. He could calm me down until I was thinking straight again. There's a long moment of silence only broken by Colton's puffs on his cigarette. When he speaks again, it's with resolve. Go find your dog, Colton. You're sitting up here mustering your courage, and Boo could be bleeding to death. You have enough firepower to turn a few charging wolves. You can do this. He takes one last deep breath. The only thing to fear is fear itself. What would FDR do? What would Jesus do? What would Muzi do? Colton gives himself a reassuring laugh. I know what Muzi would do. Fuck them before they fuck you. Semper Fi, Muzi. Colton cycles a shotgun and picks up the camera. He seems to be holding it around head height, as if resting on his left shoulder, while his right arm is seen holding a pistol. The next several minutes were uneventful. Colton comments on the sound of loons in the distance, says he can follow them back to the cabin, should he get lost. He yells boo a few times while walking into the woods, and spinning a few times, trying to see more than normal in the pitch black. His movement comes to a sudden halt, as he turns back the way he was walking, when a pair of eyes shine out from behind a tree, several yards away, and about 8 feet off the ground. They disappear behind the trunk. Colton freezes. Hey, who's there? Colton yells. The eyes slowly peek out again from behind the tree, and almost seem to wobble, and descend a foot or two. Jesus, who's there? Boo? As Colton takes a few, slow, measured steps closer, a vague gray outline of a head materializes around the eyes, and he freezes again. I'm gonna shoot you, Colton warns, as the head ducks behind the tree again. Colton alters his course to go around the tree, giving it a wide berth. He begins muttering to himself. Headshot, Colton. Headshot. He pauses as scratching begins emanating from behind the tree. His breaths come almost ragged due to fear. His right hand fumbles with the pistol as he tries to cock the hammer with a shaking hand. He makes one last jump around the base of the tree. The hissing gray face materializes again as Colton pulls the trigger. Smoke from the gunpowder momentarily blinds the camera as another shot rings out in the night. As the smoke clears, Colton's breathing has almost turned to hyperventilating. The fog clears, and the outline of a dead opossum lying on the leaves takes over. Colton sighs heavily and sets the camera down, as he mutters unintelligibly to himself. The distinct sound of a disposable lighter is heard again, followed by a long exhale. Loons call in the distance, their tremolo growing louder. The sound swiftly passes overhead and begins fading away. Shit, I'm screwed, Colton exclaims. How the hell am I supposed to find my way back now? His voice takes on a higher pitch as his fear begins creeping back in. I'm seriously turned around. I can't even hear the waves of Lake Superior anymore. I need to sleep and start again in the morning. The camera shuts off. 2:10 a.m. blinks in the corner then. Where's the light button? He demands, but pauses. Nothing but the time is on the screen, and nothing but the running of the camera is heard. It was wrong. No frogs were croaking, no crickets chirping, absolute silence. Footfalls from farther away than Colton's feet can be heard, followed immediately by Colton, what I assumed was, spinning to face it. He cocks his pistol, and says in a voice that is quite absent of fear, "Who's there?" Finally, his fingers find purchase, and the lamp clicks on. The footfalls stop. "Bowdaroo?" Colton queries, his voice tinged with fear now. His voicemail alert sounds again, but he makes no move to grab it. It made sense. One hand was on the camera for light, the other was on the pistol. "Boo? Come here, buddy," Colton says, his voice attempting to sound happy and playful to draw his dog from behind the tree his camera was focused on. Sudden movement from behind. Colton swings the camera around, and without aiming, fires. The muzzle flash illuminating the surrounding for only a moment. A gray head about 10 feet off the ground, whose eyes stare unblinkingly back at the camera in the distance. "Damn possums," Colton spits. "I'm gonna come back here in the morning, frag your ass, and eat you for breakfast." The eyes move swiftly forward, and Colton takes a step backwards, but trips over a gut. He and the camera tumble to the ground, and the light goes off. Colton fires from his phone position, each of the 4 shots illuminating the screen for a fraction of a second. A head, antlers, teeth, eyes, then silence. Colton fumbles in the darkness again, inching closer to the fallen camcorder. Before his fingers find the prize they had blindly searched for, he flicks the light on again. He turns as much as he can from a sitting position, stopping off to his left, a single pinpoint of light glimmering in the distance. He heaves himself to his feet, and quickly strides the 30-some paces in that direction. As he closes the remaining distance, he stops. Boo's collar. He collapses, the camera still pointing at the collar hanging from a low tree branch. "Boo, you stupid son of a bitch," Colton whimpers, his voice finally breaking into tears as he puts his face in his hands. He angrily pushes himself up and grabs the collar from the branch, falling to his knees, crying, "You stupid son of a bitch," over and over. He drags himself back to the camera, and as he reaches to pull it to him, his hand is covered in a red substance, the same that's seen on the collar briefly before he sets the camera in his lap, pointing up at his face. His voicemail tone sounds again, and he pulls his phone out and wipes the tears away with the back of his other, reddened hand. He puts the phone on speaker, and sets it down next to the camera as he rummages for another cigarette. "Hey Colty, it's Q. Look, I don't think we're going to be making it up there anytime soon, but I promise we are still going to come up. There's just a couple things we got to take care of to spring Evo, so we'll see you soon. Sorry again, buddy." Colton grabs the phone and dials, only to be met with a pleasant, female voice. "I'm sorry, you traveled outside your coverage area." Colton slams the phone shut out of anger and stares into the camera. Could be Sunday before anyone knows I'm dead or missing. He takes one last puff of his cigarette and checks something on the camera. Battery is running low. I'm gonna save some juice for later. Maybe try to sleep a bit. He pauses after he's turned out the light. The stars above are only broken by a few bare tree limbs and the outline of Colton's head. I pray I'll get out of here. I love you, baby. The outline of the video's player program popped up as I stared at the black screen in awe. That was the end. I hesitantly opened the file explorer on my laptop and opened the SD card. The only file on it was the video I had just spent several hours watching. I glanced out the window. The sun had set long ago, and the stars were populating the sky now. Far too many to count. I grabbed my shotgun and stepped out onto the back porch to look at them, still wary of the wolves I had seen earlier today, and the strange being I had seen Colton shoot at on the video. I stared at the night sky, my eyes roving their depths, wishing I could find answers among their numbers. The rustling came suddenly, and from about 30 yards off the path I had taken earlier. "Hey, who's there?" came the man's voice again. My heart stopped. It was the same man from earlier. He had lived. I hopped off the porch with my shotgun and pulled my phone out, switching to the flashlight app. "Hello?" I called, holding the light aloft so the man could find me. "Hello? Are you there, sir? I heard you earlier." "I'm seriously turned around here." I jumped forward, my light even higher than before. "Here, come towards my voice," I called. "I'll get you out of here and home safe. Did your wife make it?" I kept walking towards the voice, afraid that if I stopped, he'd be even further away. "I was worried about you too. Tried to call the cops," I continued. As I kept walking deeper into the woods, I listened for the man. Twigs breaking, leaves shuffling, anything. "Jesus, who's there? Boo? I'm gonna shoot you." I froze. The voice. The exact same voice I had been chasing was now coming from behind me, and I hadn't seen anything on my way past. As I began to turn, the sound of a gunshot sounded. It seemed like it was at most 50 feet away. I turned and, in one swift motion, dropped my phone, leveled my firearm, and pulled the trigger. The moment after the sound had dissipated, a demonic roar sounded from where my barrel had been pointing, then another off to my left, a third from slightly to the right of the first. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I scooped up my phone and took off like a shot into the trees, all sense of direction abandoned in favor of survival. I saw something in the flash when I fired my last shell behind me. A canine-like head. Dead. Hollow eyes. A large set of antlers protruding from its skull. And a freakish, gray, human-like body. And the teeth. Hundreds upon hundreds of sharp, 3-inch-long needle teeth. I don't know how, but I think I've lost my pursuers. For the moment. I can hear them though. In the distance. They're coming closer. Send someone. Send the police. Send the army. Send the whole goddamn military to take these things out. If we don't, they'll get bolder. They'll come into villages, then towns, and eventually cities to lure victims away before, well, I don't know what they do. But I'm assuming it's not good. They've gotten Colton Gill. And it looks like they're going to get me too. Get someone here, but whatever you do not visit this place by yourself. On March 14th, a spot appeared on the screen of my left monitor at work. At the time, it was a non-event. Just a speck of dust or bug resting on the lens of one of the exterior cameras, but it ended up being a defining moment in the downfall of my life. I worked at a company that I won't name, a small business in the warehouse district of my city. My job was a simple one that confined me to a desk, allowed me plenty of free time, peace and quiet, and a plethora of benefits. I was overnight security. 4 years were spent in an undecorated back office, sat at a desk of suitable size for a dorm or a bedroom. On it were 2 monitors, one that displayed the exterior cameras, the other, the few interior cameras that were solely on the warehouse and entrances. There were plenty of blind spots in the building, but the company wasn't large or notable enough to have any real fear of break-ins or theft. In fact, in the 4 years I worked for them, the most notable thing I had come across was a drunk man falling asleep on the doorstep and waking up a few hours later with the most bewildered look on his face. That was until the spot arrived. I had stared at these cameras, their angles, for hundreds of hours. I knew precisely what each showed. Every pixel was ingrained into my mind, appeared in my dreams due to their familiarity. While I had taken a more lax approach as comfort grew in the job, often spending my time reading or playing on my phone. There was no escaping such intimate knowledge, and the spot wasn't there before. It was still there on March 15th. Same place, same size. Identical enough that I was convinced the cameras needed cleaning. It wasn't my job to do so, but having to stare at the blotch was a far larger inconvenience than the 5 minutes it would take to clean off the lens. I took a ladder and a cloth out to the back of the loading bay. A spray bottle hung from my belt loop as I began the ascent. It didn't seem as if anything had sullied the lens, aside from some dust collected around the outer rim, but I wiped it down regardless. I was content that the job had been done as I descended, and made a cursory glance at the wall the camera faced, and saw that it was still the same collection of porous cinder blocks it had always been. And when I sat down, it remained. The same mark, the same position. not smeared nor minimized in the slightest. I made a note for the owner, citing a faulty camera facing the loading bay, and the details of my attempted fix. My job was done. It was on him to replace or fix whatever was malfunctioning. I saw him on March 16th. Told me he hadn't seen the spot I was talking about, and that everything should be fine. I went into work with a clear mind. It lasted all of a few seconds. As I settled down, unpacked my bag, and focused on the screens in front of me, immediately I rushed out to grab him, to show him what was wrong, only to see him pulling out of his parking space out front, and I was to be left alone with it again. Another night couldn't be spent under duress. I refused it. I was going to fix the issue no matter how long it took me. It sounds absurd to be so distressed by such a simple thing, but it was disturbing my peace, the proper order of things, like a dead pixel on a screen, an infuriating yet minute issue. An overreaction at the time? Maybe. But I got up in a huff, stomped through the empty building to retrieve my ladder, cloth, and spray bottle once more, and head out into the warehouse to exit into the loading bay. I didn't even make it out the door. Froze at the precipice between sheened concrete floors and the ramp. From inside I could see it, a black mark, the size of my fist on the wall. For a few seconds I stared at it, tried to tell its texture or origins, but it just seemed hollow, like someone had punched through the wall to reveal an infinite depth behind it. Not graffiti, not a stain. I could see the edges of the blocks in the wall, where they had broken away to reveal the nothing. There was no chance of me going out to check on it closer. Those brief glances more than enough to know it was outside of my pay grade. All I did was go back and check the stored video from the day at the safety of my desk. I watched every person who walked into frame, any sign that vandalism had taken place, and that I was afraid of a painted mark on a wall. Not one. My entire night was spent reviewing footage, all focus on my actual duties cast aside to see who the perpetrator had been. There wasn't one. Not a single soul had paused in front of that area either to notice the mark or to create it. It was just there, a sole spot designed for me to attack my psyche. My shift ended. I left another note. I came in, was told that the camera was working fine, that no vandalism had taken place, and to not worry. I accepted it that time. Maybe mania, a lack of sunlight finally getting to my brain, a last grasp at logic. And it was there. Of course it was there. It would always be there. My next 2 shifts, it sat and stared at me, and mocked me. Let me know that this was mine alone to suffer with. The smallest unknown annoyance created solely to torture me. Who else would be so perturbed by an innocuous black spot? Me. It had to be me. Too afraid of it to inspect it alone, to confront a wall. I left another note, and was promptly told the next day to stop with whatever asinine charade I was taking part in. I was wasting company time, and would receive a formal write-up if I continued. I snapped. March 23rd, I arrived early, grabbed my boss by his arm, and dragged him out into the loading bay while he protested all the while. Struggled against my grip. He warned me of disciplinary actions and arrest as we got out the building. I needed vindication. I had to know that it wasn't some cruel joke to test my sanity. It was there, as dead and deep as ever. A fist-sized hole in the fabric of the universe. See? See? I screamed at him. It's been there the whole time. What is it? Let go of me. He yelled back. Someone call the police already. He tugged at his own arm, his whole body weight anchored against me. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I had to get confirmation. I saw that his head was turned back into the parking lot, trying to signal someone to aid him. So I grabbed it, both hands on either side of his face, and twisted his head, forced him to look at the offending wall. Tell me it's not there. It's a fucking wall. Now let go of me. I'm not sure if he pushed me or hit me to get himself free, but the words were a strong enough blow to make my hands release him. Get out of here before I call the police. I heard the words, but couldn't help but stand still, mouth hanging open as I stared at the morcel of the void in front of me. It seemed larger now, maybe enough to fit 2 hands into. Leave or spend the night in jail, dickhead. He walked away, leaving me to wonder just what had appeared to me, and why. Perhaps it was stupidity that spurred me forward, but I couldn't help but walk up to the spot and reach out my hand. I wouldn't be allowed here again, and I had to know just what was causing me my job. Even if it was a strange hallucination, my movement was slow, not wanting my fingers to collide with concrete should the tear not actually exist. It was real though, and my fingers slid inside. I could not see them anymore. They were not covered in shadow, but seemed to disappear entirely, like they had been amputated. I could still feel them, however, still move them. So I reached in farther, to my knuckles at first, and then to my wrist. There was a slight warmth to it, almost humid, but that was the only feeling. Even as I sunk my arm in up to my elbow, and swung it from side to side, it did not collide with anything, nor could I feel the air against the hairs on my arm as it moved. A true void. There was both hatred and reverence in that moment, but any admiration or interest I had in my discovery changed as soon as I went to pull my arm out. I couldn't. It wasn't that there was some kind of pressure or suction keeping me there. I felt something. Another hand. It grasped mine, like we were shaking hands. An immense strength that I couldn't possibly break free from, as if the hand was fastened to the world itself. I struggled and screamed, and pushed my foot into the wall to try and rip myself backward, but it was all futile. Only one positive existed, that it was not trying to pull me in, as it could have done so with ease if it wished. I continued to yank and struggle with every ounce of desperation I could muster until I was launched backward and freed for seemingly no reason at all. I scrambled to my feet, got in my car, and got home as fast as possible. That was yesterday, and I've not slept since. It's not the knowledge of the void, that something lives inside it, keeping me awake, nor is it the vague, transitory numbers that I feel in my arm. What's keeping me awake is the small fist-sized pitch-black mark that has appeared on my living room wall. My plan to deal with the tear was a childish one, ultimately foolish, but it provided me a degree of respite I could not obtain knowing whatever was inside could reach through into my living room. Something lived inside, I knew that much, but its desires were unknown to me. If it wished to come across into our world, I did not want the gateway to be in the middle of my home, so I unstacked my bookshelf, pushed it to the black hole, and restacked it. A mixture of a barricade and alarm system of sorts, allowing me to know if anything tried to come through. Out of sight, out of mind. I was running from the problem. But what more could I do? The next few days went by without a hitch, aside from my hand which had developed some bruising on the palm and around the knuckles. Damage I assumed from how fiercely I was gripped by whatever lived inside. I was able to focus on hunting for a new job, and walking around my apartment freed from troubled thoughts. It was likely still there, but I felt in time it would grow bored of my passivity towards it, and move on to someone more easily perturbed. Maybe I let my guard down too much, or I believed myself safer than I actually was, but I felt confident enough to go out, have a few drinks, catch up with some friends who were blissfully unaware of my troubles. "You look like crap. Even your eyes are going gray," were the first words said to me. A shock given how much better I'd felt since the long nights and obsessive thoughts had vanished. Maria had said it with a grin though, a playful jab, hopefully not based in any reality. I didn't comment on it, nor did anyone else. The entire night was spent with harmless small talk and catching up. I did not mention my firing nor the events surrounding it. Another step towards complete avoidance of the tear, fueled by far more alcohol than was reasonable. I drank as fast as they came, and the rest of the night became a blur. I didn't drive myself there, thankfully, but had no recollection of walking through the front door, nor the flopping face first, down onto my bed, clearly too inebriated to remove my shoes before passing out. Aside from my head pounding and the slight haze to my view, I was fine on waking. Spirits were as high as possible for the day ahead. No consternation paused me before I shuffled out of my bedroom with the intention to go to the kitchen. But I was greeted with a problem. Maria was asleep on my couch, shoes kicked off, and curled up under a blanket with a pillow beneath her head. Not an unusual sight. Crashing at each other's homes was par for the course. It was what was next to her that was the issue. The bookshelf, only a few inches away from her feet as they dangled over the armrest. Get up now. We gotta get you out of here." I sprinted over to her and began yanking at her shoulders. She looked at me with half-opened eyes that were teeming with confusion and annoyance. "Screw off. Let me sleep," she grumbled. "No, up. Come on. Fire. It was the first thing that came to mind. As I pulled her up to a sit, anything that would get her safe. What? Where? She looked around, unable to see any smoke or hear any alarms. What's going on? You have to leave. You have to leave now. I tried pulling her up by her arm, but she pulled it back with force. What are you doing? Stop. Stop. She got up and stood at the other end of the couch, away from me and the bookshelf. I deflated in that moment, unable to keep up the ruse. To stop my own fears from overwhelming me, my head turned and I looked at the bookshelf. On either side of it, the depthless nothing crept outward. A few inches on both sides, enough to be obvious that it had spread in my days of ignoring it. Likely as wide as my shoulders now. What's wrong with you? I heard her grumble as she began to gather her things. I'm scared. A meek whisper carried my words. Yeah? Of what? I didn't hesitate to tug at the bookshelf and move it a few inches so that the hole could be seen better. I moved around the front and pointed at it. Of that. It showed up at work. Now, here, it's growing. I turned to look at her. She stared right at it. I need to go. No, wait. No. You need to tell me if you can see it. I asked as she made her way to the front door. Just leave me alone. Were her words as the door shut behind her. A string of profanities left my mouth. Unbridled frustration and fear flew in rapid succession. Fueled by anger, I wrenched at the bookshelf, hard enough that it toppled over and revealed the extent of the growth. My estimations were right, approximately as wide as my shoulders and a full foot in length, though it tapered inward at the bottom. What are you? I smashed both of my palms into the wall above it, repeated strikes that punctuated each word that left my mouth. Leave me alone. Stinging palms rested against the paint above it. My head hung down to my chest as I heaved in deep breaths. Eyes focused on the floor in front of me. Please, I'm begging. The words were weaker this time, desperate. I've done nothing. I raised my head slightly, enough that I was eye level with the hole. The darkness wasn't complete anymore. Two blue lights an inch away from each other had appeared, each with a dime-sized hole in the middle. I did not realize what I was looking at until the pupils constricted. I took a sharp, shuddered inhale as I stepped back from the hole, and could now see the vague outline of the figure inside of it. Humanoid in shape, but featureless aside from its eyes. Shrouded in darkness, making any facet of its form invisible. A human, or something that wanted to appear as such. The eyes were just off enough, too bright, their color solid and without detail, like someone had created an imitation of the human eye. It shook its head from side to side, and let me know that my ordeal would not end anytime soon. What do you want from me? What have I done? I asked, on the verge of tears from the dread inflicted by it. Both of its shoulders raised and lowered, a slow shrug before it closed its eyes, and blended back into the void the instant its eyes were covered. I just stood and stared, frozen in place, my eyes fixated on where the figure had appeared from. I didn't trust to turn my gaze away, fearing that it would crawl through when my back was turned and drag me into its realm. I backed up into the bedroom, and fumbled around in my covers for my phone and wallet. At no point did I break eye contact with the hole, but fortunately, did not see it return. All I knew in that moment was that I needed to go, to run, get as far away from my home as possible. With my belongings gathered, I inched from the living room wall, kept my back pressed into the paint to maintain as much distance from the other side as possible. Even when I reached for my keys, I kept my head turned to stare at the hole, and whatever lived inside. Only when I had them in hand did I break my gaze, turning and sprinting to the front door. In my panic, I do not know if I locked the door or not. My sole focus was on making it to my car and getting away from my home. There was no destination in mind. This thing could and would follow me, and to what end I was not sure. Somewhere buried in convoluted logic, I believed that I did not know where I was heading, neither could it. I drove until there was only fumes in my tank, filled it, and drove it near empty again. The sun had dipped, and night enveloped the world, a state that filled me with unease, disturbed by the fact that a tear could be created in secret, and swallow me and my car whole. A fate I would never see coming, and be helpless to escape. Endless doomed possibilities forced me to turn off the highway. An exit I made sure not to look at the name of, as to keep my temporary home a secret from even myself. A chain hotel waited by the side of the road, well illuminated by neon signs and fluorescent streetlights that washed away any shadows, and mitigated the worries of an unseen rip engulfing me. I did not linger in the parking lot regardless. Inside seemed even safer, with not a dim corner to be found in the lobby. I asked for a ground floor room, not wanting to be trapped 3 stories up, and was granted my request. My room's main lights were also on when I unlocked the door, yet I made a point to turn on every bulb that existed. Even the television was turned on, for its added safety. There would be no surprises, as if I was somehow followed by it here, I would be well aware of its arrival. My home will be temporary, another mindless day of travel ahead. In the day ahead, I'll stay here, 3 days at a maximum, just to see if it shows up. Either way, I'll move again. Where I'll end up, or for how long, I don't know. If I can gain some kind of peace here for more than a few hours, a clear head, or at least an imitation of mental fortitude, I plan on doing some research, scouring the internet for anyone else who might have seen these rips, or the thing that creates them. If it won't stop following me, I need to learn how to seal them at the very least. Otherwise, yeah, I don't want to think about otherwise. I slept for too long, lulled by the perceived security of an unknown location, an illuminated room, and medicated by everything in the minibar. I dragged myself into the bathroom, still half asleep, unable to shake the fatigue from my body. Mario was right. My eyes had dulled, no longer the sky blue they had been all my life. They looked sick now, tired enough that they couldn't sparkle any longer. They matched the rest of me. A few splashes of water on my face later, and I was able to shuffle out into the main area of the room, the combined kitchen and living room. It waited for me there, my extended sleep long enough for it to follow my tracks and find me. Much larger than my home, it now covered the vast majority of the door, close to 6 feet in height. The same width it had been behind the bookshelf still, just large enough for me to step directly into. It was not unoccupied either. 2 crystalline eyes peered into my room, blinking on occasion. I let out a puff of air through my nostrils, the smallest chuckle I could muster at the hopelessness of my situation. It's strange to feel helpless. You imagine you might become braver and willing to fight to the death, or be willing to throw a chair through a window and keep running and running until old age takes you. In reality, for me, I was struck by apathy. I wasn't willing to do much of anything. I felt defeated by the depths of nothing in front of me. So what now? I asked into the nothingness, as I stood just a few feet away from it. Do you kill me? Take my body? Drag me to hell? I don't get it. I don't get why you're doing this to me, specifically. You're just following me. Why? So let's settle this, yeah? I don't want to live like this. Like before, the being let its shoulders rise and fall. This time, however, it extended its hand outward and into this reality. Darkness no longer gave it mystery, and allowed it to hide its true form. Pale skin, a thick layer of dark hair covered the forearm, and crept onto the back of its hand. It swam its hand from side to side, grasping at the air, searching for something. It mimicked me. Exact motions from when I had reached through into its world, with the exact arm I had done so with. Curiosity compelled me to see it through. I stepped forward and grabbed its hand the way it had mine. It was warm, alive, a slight clamminess to it, almost human, except for the fact there was no give to it. The sponginess of flesh and muscle were absent, replaced by firmness, like the being was carved from rock. We stared each other in the eyes, and I watched as it tried to retract its hand. Identical motions to my own struggle, yet with none of the panic in its eyes. I let go, and it fell backwards, tumbled on the ground, and sprinted off out of view. I scowled, unsure what it meant, or why it felt the need to recreate our initial meeting. I just stood there, peered into the void, and hoped it would return with some answers. My fear of it had subsided slightly, a half-belief swelling in me that it just wanted to communicate with me. The gesture almost seemed friendly, perhaps a hint of mockery for my panic, but certainly not malicious. "Why did you do that?" I spoke a higher than normal volume, hoping my words would carry into the void. It reappeared, sliding into view from the side it had ran off from. It shrugged again. "You don't know why you do the things you do. Again, a shrug. Are you the one making these holes? It shook its head. Can you see my world? It nodded. Is your world like mine? It shook its head. What's it like? It shrugged. Can I see it? I don't know why I said it, nor why the thought came to mind. Something about the being's mimicry of me, paired with its almost childlike responses to my questions, made me curious where it had come from. It didn't seem capable of hurting me, nor have any desire to. 2 chances to crush my hand had been passed by, to grab me through to its world. I could never have stopped it. It nodded. Will I be able to come back through? It put its arm through again, and retracted it after a couple of seconds. Put your arm through again, I told it, and it followed my instructions. I had obsessed over it, enough so that I lost my job, feared it enough that I lost a friend, and grew scared of shadows. But it was all for the same reason. Uncertainty. I did not know what it was. I could not comprehend where it came from or how it was created. So I could learn. A guided tour by a being that would be familiar with it, and seemed friendly enough. Perhaps if I was more awake, I would have continued the charade longer, put up more of a fight, avoided the hole until it wore me down further. But it was always going to end this way. It had to. It wouldn't leave me alone. It could follow me endlessly. I would be the one to tire, not it. Every end to this starts with me walking through. You promise you won't hurt me, right? A stupid question from a frazzled mind, as if it would have admitted any ill will. It nodded. I grabbed onto the mirror image of my own arm with both of my hands. My breathing quickened as I felt my body be pulled forward. A slow, inevitable momentum as the black mark on the door neared. There was no turning back now, no way to avoid entering the being's world. A familiar humidity hit my hands first, then my arms, elbows, feet, knees. My nose was an inch or 2 away when the panic beset me. I didn't want to go in any farther. Realized how foolish I had been to be so impulsive. I tried to pull back to no avail as my nose and chin felt the warmth as well. I sucked in a breath. There was ground beneath me, but very little to see. The darkness of its realm was not due to an inability to see into the tear, but its general state of being. A world that light could not brighten. I felt as if I had a torch on me. It would have not shown me a single detail, no matter how close I held it to an object. That being still held onto my hand as I looked around, a soft grasp to ensure I did not wander too far. I began to wander, and scanned the world for any sign of life or detail. I saw something in the distance, a tiny ball of light, and headed towards it. I saw more of them as I walked in all directions, different sizes and shapes of light. Some as small as a pinprick, only noticeable due to the contrast against the dark. Others were as large as windows. I got close to one, and saw a car, parked. The faint outline of a prone person sprawled on the back seat. Before I was shoved backward and away from the tear by a being I could not see. The force of the push made me stumble a few feet backward, and caused immense pain through my chest where it had impacted, but it was the lack of pressure on my hand that caused me true concern. My guide had let go. Never had I felt such a sudden and violent dread overcome me, similar to the sheer panic of a child being abandoned inside a supermarket. I ran, to each tear that seemed large enough to be the one I had come through, and was shoved away from each, all with their different views and subjects they seemed to spy on. I had a vague notion of the direction we had traveled in, but found myself turning in circles often. It was only by sheer luck that I saw the interior of the hotel room I had stayed in, and sprinted toward it, calling out to my guide that I was lost, to help me, and I received no reply. The tear seemed to shrink the nearer I got to it, a steady constriction that had reduced to the size of my torso when I was still a few feet away. I got to it too slow. When it was just large enough to fit both of my arms through, I grabbed the sides and tried to pull, as if I had the strength to rip it wide enough for me to fit through. Up close, I could see the view of the hotel room as it shrank, and myself standing in the middle of it. Motherfucker. Why? I screamed out to myself. The mirror of me turned, and stared at me for a second as the hole grew small enough to force my fingers out, and through the pinhole I saw its eyes, grayer now than before, as it shrugged and walked off right before the hole closed. I heard others, screaming and cursing, pleading to be back through as the holes grew and closed, until not a single tear was visible, and true nothingness existed. Endless plays of misery followed, repeated over and over, in pitch darkness. No matter where I ran, or how I hid, I was always forced to see glimpses of what they did to us, toys to be drained and abused for their entertainment. What we did to one another was no better. You would hear it constantly. What anger and desperation made people commit. We were all civilized once, but the cruelty inflicted upon our minds turned us into animals, scared and savage. It's why I was so happy to see the light, why I fought and clawed, bit and ripped, to get a front row seat and stare through the pinhole. I learned everything about him through a spot that would have been impossible for him to notice, up in the corner of his kitchen. He gave me something to see beyond the madness, something to learn aside from the violence I was surrounded by. He leads a nice life, a wife and young child, long days but comfortable. It was hard to adapt to normal life again, some unfortunate growing pains, moments where I forgot how the world works, but he lives well now. I live well now.